Right, so this afternoon for this session, I'm going to, there we go, share with you some strategies that we can be using. It doesn't really matter what institute you work in, whether you're in a school full time, whether it's small groups, large groups. All of the strategies that I share with you today, I think you'll find pretty helpful. Now, as part of my role for the English Hub, we focus on systematic teaching of phonics with young children and adults that are learning to read in English. But one of the areas that we also look at is the development of language, and predominantly where there's a language gap. That may be for a number of reasons. It might be because of the demographic that the children live in and that they're entering education with a poorer language. Or it could be that they've got English as a learning language. So the strategy that I'm going to share with you this afternoon has been influenced by research and it's been tried and tested. It is about closing the language gap. And as you can imagine, it takes a period of time to introduce it into a setting, but the more you practice it, the easier that it gets. Some of the strategies I'll share with you today, they will be just on the screen, but I've got a little bit of demo to do with you as well, so I'll be switching between the two. What I share with you can be used with any book whatsoever, so that's really helpful too. Right, so closing the language gap, the power of reading stories aloud. By the end of today's session, I think we'll probably be about an hour or so. I'll make myself available at the end as well. So if you've got any questions at all, just pop them into the chat and I can sit around for a good half an hour afterwards to answer any of your questions as well. By the end of today's session, we'll have looked at the research behind storytelling and how it is there to increase the language comprehension skills of our learners. We're going to look at the true benefits of reading aloud, the storytelling program itself that I've actually put together for you. It's a 5-day program, and then consideration about how you might organise it as well. The intended impact that it will have, and also a little bit of time to reflect on what you currently do in your own setting, but thinking about how you might use some of these strategies today going forward. Okay, so the research, what does it tell us? The Education Endowment Foundation has put a really good comprehensive report together about developing your early literacy in learners, but it states clearly that early reading should be developed using a balanced approach. That balanced approach, it's really important that it focuses both on language comprehension and also the learner's ability to decode the text. When we say crack the code, that's where the phonics comes into play as well. So they learn the sound, what it looks like on the page. But not only that, we need to have that language comprehension, and rich understanding of vocabulary as well. That to support the language comprehension, learners appear to benefit from a range of complementary activities. These activities need to really focus on their development of vocabulary, the development and understanding of language structures, and background knowledge. So the ability to make connections between what's going on in the story and things that they're already familiar with day to day, outside world, the big wide world around us. Storytelling and the time to actually share reading with children has consistently been shown to improve that language. Now, there are a number of frameworks that can be used for this and to support that shared reading. So they often emphasise different aspects of comprehension. One of the frameworks that I've used quite frequently in a number of schools in the Midlands is something called the peer framework, which I'll go into a little bit more detail with you. I think it's on our next slide. And these are just easy techniques that you can follow with the learner day in, day out to build that language comprehension. We also encourage the peer approach, which I'll cover with you, with parents and with the learners at home as well. So these are techniques that you can share with parents or carers so that they can be reinforcing it when the child leaves the school building. One of the things as well, to support the development of decoding, children are obviously likely to benefit from activities that focus on alphabetic knowledge. That can be done quite quickly, but also that systematic synthetic approach to the teaching is really quite crucial. So what I want to do now is just draw your attention to what this diagram here on the right hand side. This is what we call the simple view of reading. Most of you may be quite familiar with this already, but I just want to go into a little bit more detail about it and to where the pupils would fit on this grid. Okay, so if we start down here in the left hand corner, going up the left hand side is the ability to decode, which is to recognise what's being written on the written page, what's in print. Okay, their ability to read from left to right, identify each of the individual sounds to build a word, and then once they get to the end of that word or the end of the phrase or sentence, they can comprehend, they can understand what is being said to them in the text. The boxes going along here, so that was going up, that decoding. From left to right here, that's the understanding around the text, the language, and the true comprehension and understanding. So can they recall information from the text? Have they got the ability to predict what might be coming up in the future? Are they familiar with some of these words that they see in the text once they've cracked them? Do they really know what those words mean? Now, in the bottom left-hand corner here, it talks about poor word recognition and poor comprehension. That would be a child or a learner of any age that has had no input. So they've had no phonic teaching, no alphabetic knowledge, they've had no book talk, and they're not read to. Okay, so they would come into this category here because they haven't had the strategies shown to them or shared with them from an early age. We want them up here eventually, but I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, if in school a child consistently has phonic teaching day in, day out, that follows that systematic program from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, and they've cracked that code, but there's no book talk, or they're not read to with, I don't know, text levels that are at a higher level to which they're decoding, they would end up in the top left quartile here, which means they've got good word recognition because they recognise the sounds on the page, they recognise that those individual sounds put together form a word, and that those words from left to right form a sentence. However, they don't have embedded a true understanding of the events, the characters, what the language means, because it's too far removed from their understanding. They've had no exposure to being read to. Similarly, in the bottom right here, these would be learners, children who are read to frequently, but actually they don't follow a systematic program for phonic teaching. Okay, so they would have poor word recognition, they wouldn't be gaining that fluency and understanding, but they've got a good level of comprehension and understanding. What we want is for our learners to be up here in the top right corner, so that they've had a good balance of study, which includes phonic teaching and also the opportunity to be read to, reading aloud, and engaging in that quality book talk. So if I move on to the next slide, this is what I talked about earlier with the peer framework. Now, this sequence that I've got here from top to bottom, it's a very simple sequence that can be used to support shared reading or dialogue when you're reading between pupil and teacher. Now, when you're reading together, this is something that the adults can pause and they would do the following, okay? So they might prompt the learner to say something about the book. So it could be as simple as, what did you notice? Is there anything that you don't like? What do you think might happen next? That made you laugh. Can you tell me why that made you laugh? So just a simple prompt. Then they might evaluate what the child has said back to them, expand on what the child has said back to them by adding a little bit more information to it or rephrasing it. So the child might give a one-word answer and you would rephrase by formulating a complete sentence, and then repeat the prompt to help the learner from that expansion. So that's why we call it the peer framework. Now, for example, you were looking at a book, I don't know, about a zoo. The parent might point at the picture and say, "Oh, what's that?" The child replies, "It's a zebra." Then to evaluate, the adult would say, "That's right, it's a black and white stripy zebra." Can you say stripy zebra? So they've picked up on the original idea of the child and they've just expanded that vocabulary a little bit further. Now, part of that peer sequence, we do have 5 main prompts that can be used, okay? 5 things that you could do to develop the child or the learner even further when they're learning to read. They are as follows. Completion. That's where you start a sentence and then you just leave a blank at the end for the child to complete it. So it could be, for example, "Oh, the zebra felt really sad at the zoo when," and then they complete it for you. Simple recall here, asking the learner about something they've already read. It might have a simple link. Can you tell me another story that included a zebra? That kind of thing. Open-ended, often with a focus on the illustrations. So you might refer to a picture. Well, it says here in the text that the witch was feeling really unhappy. What can you notice in the picture that tells us she's unhappy too? Simple prompts like we would in general that begin with who, what, where, when, why. And then this one here is called distancing, and that again is just making connections. So it might be that they've read a book or heard a story by the same author. They might have experience of going to a zoo, so they talk about that visit. So anything that can make that connection. Okay, so I'm going to share with you a little bit of a story about a child called Sophie. So I'm just going to read it aloud to you, okay? And see if you can identify potential learners in your environment that sound pretty similar. Okay, Sophie. Sophie's parents talk a lot with her as they go about their everyday lives. They talk about things that they see, things that they do, and about every single story that they might read to her. They listen and they respond to Sophie's many comments, her observations, her questions, helping her to understand new vocabulary, new concepts, and new ideas that she has. By age 3, Sophie has heard over 33 million words. That would include different synonyms, a range of syntax, and she has had in total 1,700 hours of story time just by the age of 3. She knows many different nursery rhymes, and she can recite most of them off by heart with little prompting or just finishing off at the end. She knows many fairy tales, and in particular, she has favourite stories that she asks for again and again and again. Now, then you've got Harvey. So Harvey's parents don't talk with him very much at all. But then nor did their parents talk much to them either. The 9 million words that Harvey has heard by the age of 3 are much more limited in range, and they're generally a little bit more instructional. Harvey has only had 25 hours of story time because Harvey isn't read to every single day. At age 3, Sophie is 24 million words, 1,675 story hours ahead of Harvey. And then even more sadly, the gap between them grows wider and wider each year, which in turn makes it much harder for Harvey to understand and learn at school. It means that even when you've taught Harvey how to read, and we do that pretty quickly through the phonic programme, he will struggle to understand many of the different words that he sees on the page. So, just bear that in mind. I've got a little quote here about the benefits of reading aloud. And this is from a fantastic lady that I've had the privilege of working with here in the UK called Ruth Miskin. She developed a phonic programme, so she's quite an advocate of children being read aloud to. It said, "Did you know that being read to is the most powerful predictor of a learner's future reading comprehension? By reading aloud to a learner every single day, you are fusing in the act of reading with comfort and with love. And then when you love a book as teacher or parent, your learner, your child, will want to hear it again and again. As humans, we're very much wired to thrive on repetition. So when you've read a story like Brown, Brown Bear, What Do You See? Or Room on the Broom, I could think of multiple others, Peace at Last, for the 100th time, remember you are hardwiring those children's brains for success." So Sophie is one of those children. Okay, so reading aloud to the children every day, the expectation really is that it needs to happen. So if you imagine children don't have that at home, I know many of those, we've got a duty to do it in the setting, whichever setting that we're working in, okay? Just 15 minutes a day will enable the following things to happen for that child. They will learn how to pay attention. They will have a wider breadth of vocabulary, and they will have a much deeper understanding of language. They'll have a knowledge of new places and people and things that are real and things that are make-believe. They'll quickly learn and they'll develop a knowledge of how stories work. The understanding of analogy, comparison between two different things, comparing it to something that they might do at home, something that they've experienced themselves, but also a comparison with another story. So it might be a character felt in the same way. They'll have the ability to think ahead, the ability to hypothesize and to infer what the characters are thinking, and just guessing those predictions. The more they read, the clearer that becomes. Opportunity for discussion. It could be of moral issues, learning right from wrong, the various themes that we see in these excellent narratives. They'll have sensitivity, phonological sensitivity to alliteration, to rhyme and to rhythm. And also, just that 15 to 20 minutes each day, we're building that interaction they have with other learners and with adults. So, things to think before I show you the programme that we're going to give a go. Things that we'd like you to do when you're thinking about that story time. How can you make it special? Does it need to be fancy? But do you do it once in a blue moon? Or do you do it every day? So they learn that routine. Is it a rushed 5 minutes at the end of a session, or do you build it into the morning when they're far more awake and alert? How can we affect that curiosity that the learners have got? By drawing them into the text before we've even started it. Simple statements or things that you've noticed about the book that you're going to read with them. Read the whole story the first time without stopping too much. We don't need to analyse it. We don't need to break it down. We don't need to be asking lots of questions. Let the author do the hard work and let the children just sit back and take it in. Talk. Thinking carefully about what talk you're going to include. So thinking of phrases that you might share with them. Showing yourself as a learner. I wonder why you did that. I can't believe the witch behaved in that way. Did you see how mean she was to Charlie? So all of those different phrases. Link stories to their previous experiences. I'm going to share a story with you in a little while, but thinking of, in this character, he's always late. So it could be, do you remember when you were late for school that once? How did you feel? What did you notice? What did the other children say to you? Read it several times. Read it and enjoy it. Read with enthusiasm. This is one that takes a bit of practice at times. Worked with a practitioner recently, and they won't mind me sharing this with you. But when it came to story time, they used to freeze, they'd go awkward. And then when we unpicked it further, they themselves had never really experienced that quality time of being read to as a child. So we used to practice the voices, also videoing ourselves to see what faces we pull. So don't be embarrassed to try those voices because, let's face it, they love them. And also keep reading to pupils. So once they get to a certain age and they can read independently, yes, that's fab, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't stop reading to them. I think of my goddaughter, actually going off track slightly, Amelie. We read to her all the time. When before we were in lockdown, she'd go to the library every Monday after school, choose several books, and I always go for supper with them on a Monday evening. So she'd been to the library. And generally, we'd read all 5 that she'd taken out of the library before bedtime. But the joy of that, really, that she would, once you've read them to her again and again and again, it got to the point, although she can't read it, she was mouthing the words as we went along. So before Amelie even started school, she knew that language structure. She'd had a head start, really, because of that experience of being read to. Anyway, I digress, so we'll move on. Okay, so the programme that I'm going to share with you today, something for you to think about using in the future, should you wish, has a really simple organisation, which is handy. Now, the idea, the principle behind it is that actually we do read to those children every day. So we don't want it to be once every couple of weeks that we find a text out. But you use one text and you use it all week. And trust me, they don't get bored of it because of what we're going to build in around it as well. The idea would be, so that we've got lots of Sophies, is that they're read to 20 minutes every day out loud by the adults in the room. In addition to those 20 minutes, at some point during that day, you'd be wanting to build on their vocabulary, which will become a bit clearer. The session I ran on Monday, we talked about vocabulary instruction. It's all done verbally, but it's building that 10 minutes in at a different time to the story. But the element I'm going to focus on here today is this bit here. So, general organisation. One of the key things that you need to do, it's quite straightforward, is think about where you're positioned, where the learners are positioned, and where what we call spotlight learners, which I'll talk to you in a bit more detail. I use this phrase quite a bit. That came from Ruth. She won't mind me sharing. Position yourself where you can be seen by all. So learners should be in the V, so the V of your arms, to see. Okay? If they're not, if they're on the outside of that, you're not going to have their full eye contact or engagement, and they won't see you properly. They'll also miss out on the nice illustrations and stuff as well. So keep the learners in the V to C. During the story time, we remind the learners that we've got certain cues that we use for behavioural things, really, and during story time. So one of those is magnet eyes. The idea being, I'll break them down in more detail, but their eyes are on you. TTYP is just talk to your partner. And my turn, your turn, so that they know when the interaction is going to take place. That can be done with one hand, my turn. When you signal, it's their cue to join in, or you could do two. And then we have our spotlight learners as well. These would be the Harveys of the class. So these would be the children that potentially have not had that experience of story time. So we would want Harvey, the spotlight children. You've got your V. The spotlight children would be down the centre, so they're in your direct eye line, and you can take visual clues from them, really. They're your focus children that potentially have got huge gaps in that language. So, classroom strategies. These are the ones I talked about before, just for story time. We would use magnet eyes. The idea that you just put your fingers to your eyes, and then the children would imitate you. So it doesn't matter if you don't all have the same language at this point, because they learn those visual cues. The children would imitate you and do the same, just to show you that they're ready. It's a nice one, actually. They do like that one. My turn, your turn, so that if you're speaking or you're going to say a phrase out loud of the story, it would be my turn. If you want the children to join in, you open your palms out to them, your turn, so that they do exactly the same. Spotlight learner, as I said before, these are the ones that need your attention the most. We don't want our Sophies outside of the V, but they may be further towards the edge of that V, because they've already got that understanding, but your Harveys would be down the centre. Turn to your partner. That can be done at different points throughout the story, which I will demo to you. That'll become a lot clearer. But with the turn to your partner, talk to your partner, it's just a simple gesture, and then you open the gate. So turn to your partner. And then the stop signal, that's to avoid like shouting over, really. So if you've got a large number of people in the group, which I have had, rather than having to use your voice to get everybody to stop, or clapping and all these different things that you can do, you just hold your hand up. As soon as one sees you hold your hand up, they put their hand up, and so on around the room. So you get a ripple effect really quickly without having to make it really fancy. So if you want them to stop, just use the stop sign, and the children gradually join in. Okay, so this is the program in itself. The idea would be that you have one story, and you would repeat that story over the course of 5 days. There's method behind the madness, because you build on it as the week goes on. Now, before you can go on to this 5-day mini program, it's not too onerous. We're talking 20 minutes, but the crucial bit before we can even get on to this is the preparation stage, which I'm going to talk you through before we go on to the program itself. Okay, so I'm just going to stop that slide so you can see me more clearly, and then I can also see that I'm doing it right as well. Okay, preparation. So I've chosen for my text for this week, for example, I've chosen Tiddler. Okay, it's a great book, actually. If you haven't read it, I bet you already have. But really fabulous, stimulating material. The hardest part really was the preparation, and I think all in all it probably took me 15 minutes to do the prep for it. But then I've got this piece of magic for the rest of the week going ahead then for 5 days. And when I think of the language that we'll have developed at the end of those 5 days, it's pretty phenomenal. So planning time is kept to a minimum. Now, before we can start the actual unit, obviously we need to have read the story, which is always helpful. But we need to think about the following things really, which I'm just going to share with you. I will need to refer to this because I've written quite a lot down. Thinking about, first and foremost, how we're going to actually read the story to them. And then importantly, practicing reading that story out loud, which is where we talked about that filming. I've got some really irritating habits, which I'm quite aware of. But when I watched it back on a video of myself reading a story, I didn't realise how bad they were. So, for example, I used the word so an awful lot. When I watched it back on the video, I thought, not great really. So there you go. So perhaps just put your phone in front of you. Nobody else has got to watch it. Record yourself reading that story so you can see the different facial expressions and stuff that you're using. The success of how this works will rest on how well you can read that story out loud to the pupils. Okay, now what I did first for each of these, I am like post-it note queen. Seems obvious, I know. I've numbered with the post-it notes each of the pages. There's method behind the madness, okay? I've tried to put them out of the way so that they're not over illustrations that are important. Ideally, they'll probably be smaller than this, but for today, to show you, I've used a bigger one. That'll become clearer as to why I've done that as well in a little while as we move down the programme. So think about the voice that you're going to use for the narrator and for the different characters. So if you've got a part where the character's mischievous, like Tiddler is in here, have you got a mischievous voice that you can be using for the children? And then thinking about how you'll read with the expression as well. So if there's a section that's shouting, are you going to use a loud and important voice for that emphasis? For example, I can see it clearly because of these post-it notes, page 5, okay? On the bottom bit here, we've got, sorry I'm late, I was swimming around a shipwreck. I swam into a treasure chest and someone closed the lid. I bashed and I thrashed till a mermaid let me out again. Oh no, she didn't. Oh, yes, she did. So it's thinking about that emphasis there. Then I've got another one. If I flick to page 12, when I was reading it, there was a moment of pause as well. Yeah, here we go, page 12. As I was reading it through. He didn't hear the fisherman. He didn't spot... I'm just going to have a see. So it's building up, again, that emphasis before we turn to the next page. But also, when we're in that preparation stage, aside from the voices, it's thinking about how you might think out loud in front of the children. I'll give you an example. Yeah, this is the one. At 9 o'clock on Monday, Miss Skate called the register. Little Johnny Dory. Yes, Miss Skate. Rabbit fish. Yes, miss. Redfin. Yes, miss. Tiddler. Tiddler. Tiddler's late. Oh, Tiddler's late. I wonder where he is this time. So that there was my thinking out loud at the end of that phrase. Now, what I did with each of these areas, you don't want too many really, but I have actually gone through and just made those little notes of where I might use emphasis. Not for all of it because you get into the flow anyway, but some of that wondering time in front of the children, they'll be itching to join in. I don't know, miss, I don't know why he's late, as we go through. Now, the other thing that we can use an aside for as well is to explain the meaning of some of that new vocabulary, which is where we're going to close that language gap, okay? I've just made a note here. Do not ask the children for the meaning of words. I'll go through a couple of examples in a minute. because actually if we are asking the children for the meaning, we're going to distract completely from the storytelling itself. So a couple of the words that I've thought, they might not know, it might be completely new vocabulary for them. I've put a kind of child-friendly, learner-friendly explanation on the page that it comes across. For example, that's where you can use an aside. Once there was a fish and his name was Tiddler. He wasn't much to look at with his plain grey scales. Scales. I think they're like hard bits of skin on the fish's body. So that again would be your aside. So rather than asking them, because they won't have come across that word before, you're showing yourself as a learner and you're giving a little snippet of extra information in there as well. The other thing in preparation, so I've numbered the pages. I've identified where I might use some of my thinking out loud. I've identified potential vocabulary that might be new to them. But also we're going to be doing something called a favourite phrase, which will become a little bit clearer as we go on. I think it was on, if I go onto the slides, it's day 3 of the programme. So yeah, you would highlight those favourite phrases. I'll come back to those in a little while. Okay. Now the other thing that I did in the front here, I've just made a little bit of a note of particular words that we might come across that actually learning needs to happen with those words. For example, captured, struggled, dawdled, hauled, shivered, peeped. Because at some point, so maybe it'll be, well, not really incidental, I'll plan it in, but some discussion around that with the children at a later date as well. So that is our preparation. If I just go back to the slide here. So all of that prep, post-it note prep, as I like to call it, has happened before day 1. Okay? And I've then got that book ready for the entire week. So on day 1, which I will break down for you a bit further, we have 3 elements to day 1's activities. We've got an introduction, which I'll go through with you, reading the story itself, and a section called What is the Problem? So I'll break it down. So day 1, we've got introduction, okay? The first thing that we do with children, obviously, and any learners, is to introduce the story. What I quite like about this is there is a little bit more intrigue about it. So in the past, they might have gone, right, today we're going to read Tiddler, and it's by Julia Donaldson and Axel Schiffer. But actually, we can build on that a lot more. So we're going to introduce the story to the children so that they really want to hear what's going to happen to Tiddler. Right, I've got a fantastic book here. It's called Tiddler. Now, I want you, children, to think of a time when you've told a fib, okay? A little lie. Tiddler, he's a fish. And he's a fish who likes to tell lots of made-up stories. The trouble is, we never know if they're true. Should we work out together to see if he's telling the truth? Are they true or are they make-believe? Now this story about the fish, the one that makes up the little fibs, the stories, it's called Tiddler, and it's by Julia Donaldson and Axel Schiffer. And that's your intro, okay? Once you've done that introduction on day 1, you would then read the story aloud. What I would avoid on day 1 is using any extra commentary, really. Let the author, let the story do the work. So you've done that lovely introduction and you just let the children sit back and you read it aloud to them. You might do a couple of the I wonder as you go along, And you might do a couple of the explanations of some potentially of the vocabulary, but you wouldn't break it up too much because you just want it to flow right through. Let the story, she called it, weave that magic, okay? Make sure you draw them in with those voices. Now, once you've read it on that day one, so you've done the introduction, you've read it, we've got to identify what the problem is. Now, in the first instance, you read the story to the children, and just to check what they have absorbed, you would do a let's turn to your partner, and you would expect the children to be able to answer just a couple of key questions to see what they can recall in terms of the plot, that kind of thing. So it might be, who are the characters in that story? Who is that main character in that story? And it would be as simple as that. Once you've done that, so you've introduced it, drawn them right in, read the story, asked 2 questions maximum, you would then go on to explain what the problem is with that story. And it might be a little bit something like this, Mel's demo. Now, there's a problem in our story. And I think the problem is that Tiddler tells tales about why he's always late for school. One day, he is late for a real reason. He gets caught in a fisherman's net and he becomes lost. And that's that one. So, if we just go back. And that is day one. The introduction, you've read it. And you personally have told them what the problem is. You haven't asked them to identify a problem. They might not understand that terminology at that stage. You're expressing what you think the problem is to them. Okay. Now, on day 2, as we've got here, you would just reread the whole story again. You don't need to do the introductions because we've done that. You don't really need to talk about the problem because you've done that on day 1 and you're going to be coming back to that at a later stage. But you do need to reread that story. So make sure that you don't interrupt them too much by asking loads of questions, okay? Make it look like you're thinking to yourself. But this is where you would bring in some of those planned asides, okay? So it might be some of those facial expressions, the explanation into the meaning of words, that kind of thing. That would happen more so here. Okay, day 3. This is broken up into 3 parts again, okay? And we call that favourite phrases, feelings from the story, and which is the right sentence. So, day 3, really, you're going to emphasise what we call favourite phrases, which I'll show you in just a minute, okay? The my turn and your turn element that we use on day 3 will actually allow the children to listen to new phrases, but also it will allow them to practice saying some of these sentences with new vocabulary that ordinarily that they wouldn't use. So you're plotting that rehearsal in on purpose almost. Yeah, I'll share some of those with you. On day 3 then, once we've shared some of those favourite phrases with the children and overemphasised them, we'd let the children practice some of them as well. Okay, so if I just find a couple of my favourites. I've highlighted them on the post-it note prep. Yeah. So let me read this bit to you. Tiddler rode a seahorse. Tiddler met a mermaid. Tiddler met a turtle who saved him from a squid. Tiddler found a shipwreck. Tiddler found a treasure chest. Oh, no, he didn't. Oh, yes, he did. That end bit there is what I would class as a favourite phrase. That is a phrase that you can get the children to join in with. So in the method of my turn, your turn, I'd finish that little bit of sentence there, get to the end, and I'd say, right, children, let's practice saying that together. Off you go. And they would do it interacting. Oh, no, he didn't. Oh, yes, he did. And they would practice with their voices. Okay? Then there'd be another one. Let me flick a bit further. I heard it from a starfish. I heard it from a place. The place said, just a minute. Don't I recognise your face? That again could be what I call a favourite phrase. So at these points in the story, you would say them, let the children practice them, potentially reread it, and then let them join in, okay? Now, the reason we're calling them favourite phrases, because following the story time, then if you've done it earlier in the session, during the afternoon or during the course of the morning, you'd use these phrases throughout the day. You try and use them. Let me just have a look. Oh yeah, so Tiddler, in this story, basically, if you've not read it before, Tiddler is always making it, he's late for school, he's always got an excuse, and that's where these, what we call tall tales have come from, because he got stuck in a net, he was riding on a seahorse, I'm sorry I'm late, I was flying with a ray. So we would then try and make up our own excuses throughout the day. So as teacher, you might say, children, I'm so sorry I'm late. The thing is, I went to the supermarket and then I had to go and sing in front of the entire school. And then the children would come out with the phrase, oh, no, you didn't. Oh, yes, I did. So you're building in that favourite phrase to the day. So you could then get the children to sneak in what I call the tall story, like Tiddler does, and say, I'm so sorry I'm late. I went to, and then everybody chorally would join in and say, oh, no, you didn't. Oh, yes, I did. So they would become some of those favourite phrases, okay? Right. Once you've done, yeah, we're still on day 3. Let me just go back. Apologies. So once we've done those favourite phrases with the children, that will entirely depend on the story. I know, for example, room on the broom might be a text. Is there room on the broom for, like me? You would be building that into your day as well, trying to use some of that vocabulary. The next thing we would do then is to explore some of the feelings from the story, okay? And we can do that using a couple of methods really, but the one that we're going to go with would be what Ruth would call freeze frame feelings, okay? The point of this really is that the children are being given a chance to show with their bodies, to show with their face, how the different characters might be feeling, but at different points in the story. So they haven't got to be a drama expert. It's very short and sharp and on the spot. So in the first instance, you would say to the children, right, when I read the story to you again today, okay, I want you to be Tiddler's classmates, okay? So when I say freeze frame, you are going to be the classmates, and I want you, with your bodies, with your faces, to show me how they're feeling, okay? For example, if I flick to, let me find the page. Oh yeah, page 15. So Tiddler's late, okay? It's 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, still no Tiddler. 12 o'clock, lunchtime, where could he be? Freeze frame. So the children would show how the classmates are feeling at that exact point in time in the story. And you would say to them, it's nearly home time, and Tiddler, he's not at school. Freeze frame that. How do you feel? Then the teacher would say to them, oh, you look upset. And then the children would mouth back, we are upset. You look when he returns. You look relieved. We are relieved. So you're getting them to use that vocabulary. My word, you look glum. We do feel glum, okay? So you're giving them those new words to emphasize the fact that they're feeling sad, but you've given them two new ones. A bit later on, you could do exactly the same, where he returns from, he finally gets there, I think it's something like 3:30, he gets to school. And again, you would do the same. Tiddler, he swam into school at 3:30. Freeze frame. How do the classmates feel then? And they start joining in. That's quite a nice one, really. Now, the next one, so you've got favourite phrases, feelings from the stories. You would then do which is the right sentence. Again, we're still building on that language gap. We're still enforcing them to incorporate it into their dialogue. Okay? So we would play something called which is the right sentence. You would give them two sentences, and they've got to give the thumbs up or the thumbs down for whichever one they believe it to be. Okay? Little Johnny Dory thinks Tiddler's stories are exciting. Little Johnny Dory thinks Tiddler's stories are boring. You would then give it to them so that they can say them out loud. Little Johnny Dory thinks Tiddler's stories are exciting. Little Johnny Dory thinks Tiddler's stories are boring. They then come back to you and they give the appropriate one. Because by this point, like you're on day 3, because they've heard it so many times, they've done those freeze frames, you've done those phrases, they're really starting to understand the plot, the characters, those feelings, that new language. But we're not putting pressure on them to say which one's right, which one's wrong. They're building that language, exciting, boring, okay? Terrified, happy, and then they choose which one it would be. Okay, so on day 4 here, at that point then, more so you'd be expecting the children to join in with the story, not all the way through, but especially with things like the favourite phrases that they did the day before. You've emphasised them whilst you read the story aloud. They've had a go at saying them a couple of times. You've used them in the normal setting for the rest of the day, but then on day 4 they're really joining in quite vocally with some of those favourite phrases. Okay, now what I tend to do with that one is I'm rereading, so we're always going right back to the beginning. We're not unpicking it, we're not analysing it, we're going back. And what I tend to do with those favourite phrases is emphasise them really loudly, pause, and then let them join in. We also then go on to how that problem is solved. Okay, so this is where you would go back to, what was the problem? Say it out loud again. Now, I think, if I remember rightly, the problem was that Tiddler tells lots of stories. We don't know if they're true, and we didn't know if they were make-believe. The thing is, though, because we didn't know if they were make-believe, Tiddler, he then got lost in the ocean and he had to find his own way home. Turn to your partner. How did he sort out the problem? And that's where, once we've done that one, they've verbalised how it's been solved. But again, we're not just saying, how did he solve the problem? We're going back, retracing those steps, and you're almost thinking out loud to the children before you ask them, well, how did he solve it? Can you turn to your partner first and discuss it? Just turn to your partner. Then they would feed back. Okay. On day 5 here, we've got just 2 things that you would do with them. Again, you're going to read that story. You will feel like you've read it hundreds of times. Truth is, realistically, it's just 5. That's 5 repetitions for those children to keep listening to that new language, verbalise it, think about it, answer questions about it, reflect on it, but in a really informal way. So day 5, there's just 2 activities, okay? It's going to get them to think about the character's behaviour in a lot more detail. So it might be that you decide, is the character nice or nasty? And that's done in a really simple way by asking a couple of questions. So does Tiddler, does he behave in a nice or a nasty way? The one thing about that that's nice is that actually not always do the children agree, and that's absolutely fine, because if anything, you're going to encourage a little bit of healthy debate for that one as well. If they've said that he's nice, it would then be taking it further. Right, turn to your partner. How do you know that he behaves in a nice way? What does he do? And then they would feedback. So it might be, he tells truth at the end. That's the answer that comes back from them. But actually, you would rephrase it for them to help. So it would be, so Tiddler behaves in a nice way because he tells the truth at the end. Again, elaborating on what they've done. Then the final one here would be to quiz that character. We have to put the children in role as one of those characters, but because we're on day 5, it's non-threatening really. We're not putting them on the spot to think of something that they've got no understanding of. They've lived and breathed Tiddler all week, or whichever text you've chosen. So you would explain to them that this is the structure we're going to follow. I'm going to ask the question. You're going to turn to your partner. We'll feed back, okay? And you're going to pretend that you're that character when I ask you the question. So the turn to your partner might be, who did you say let you out of the treasure chest, Tiddler? They talk about it, they make up an answer, they come back to you. You would then build on it and rephrase, because the child might say, mermaid. So you're saying that a mermaid let you out of the treasure chest, and then you would help them say it. I said that a mermaid let me out of the treasure chest. So that quizzing really is just ask the question, let them talk about it. They come back to you. If it's just a 1-word or a 2-word answer, rephrase it so that they're giving a bit more detail and you're elaborating, on what they've said, okay? But all the time, they've got to pretend to be that character. Another one might be, you got caught in a net. How did you feel? Turn to your partner. They would then discuss it with their partner. Scared, frightened, trapped. Oh, you felt scared when you were caught in the net? And then they would say, yes, I felt scared when I was caught in the net. Okay, then the final one really on day 5 is just sharing with others. So it might be that you've got 1 copy, it might be that you've got multiple copies, they can't read it, but actually by this point you'd want them sharing this story amongst each other, being able to recall it. And to be honest, I think they pretty much will be able to recall it, especially if you haven't got many copies. It's just having that available in your space so that they can go up and they can look through it and start verbalising that story to each other. So what I would like you to do, just for a couple of minutes, I know it's quite a big model that I've shared with you, but think about what could this model, look like in your own setting. Obviously, it doesn't have to be Tiddler. If you've got older children, it could be any text. any narrative. But how could you use this model where you work now? That talk through story. But also when you're having that little bit of reflection time, thinking about how might it need to be adapted. Is it that you don't want to use every element, but are there some strong elements, particularly here when you're reading and the problem and the introductions and those favourite phrases that might be handy? Is it that the quizzing of the character, or nice or nasty, they might find tricky? But potentially, how could you build that over time? What's quite nice with this model is that it will work with any book. And 1 week you might do, I don't know, Tiddler. It could be, I've got Julia Donaldson on the brain today. There's multiple authors. Perfectly Norman, whichever text you're using, this model would be the same regardless of the text. So you would just repeat the same model week on week. And then by the end, they've got a really good repertoire as well of stories that they're familiar with. And just think of all that story time, the hours that they've had. So just think about how you would like it to look. Now, the environment I always find a little bit of a tricky one. I'm just going to share a couple of do's and don'ts with you. Just things that I found from experience, really. They're important. They're quite simple, but it's all about finding the right books for your environment. Having books that will engage. So sometimes less is more. I tend to find, I cleared out some rooms recently and they'd got an abundance of books, but they just weren't the quality that you would want. And the children, the learners, could not engage with them because they just weren't pitched at that right level. They weren't engaging, they were tatty. They'd got lots of them, but they weren't great. So we just stripped it back to nothing and said we'd rather have 2 really good books than 50 that aren't any good to us. So thinking about the books that will engage, are they the appropriate interest level? But making that time to read to your pupils. Like when we went back, if I went right back to that big, one of those, sorry, get my words out, one of those earlier slides and talked about that the impact that reading to the children actually has in terms of developing that language, closing that gap, teaching them how to focus, how to interact with each other, all of those benefits, really making that time and making it feel special. If and when you can, trying to create a space that's comfortable. I'm going to give you some big don'ts on that in just a minute. So that they can sit comfortably, so they can see you. And are they in that V to see? Organising familiar books nearer to the front so they can go back to them. Like we said before, once you've read it, can they go back and have another look themselves? One other thing I have done as well is like top 5. So our favourite 5, I position them so they were just facing out for them to see. And then, if anything, if you've got books that have got a strong narrative, is it something that they can connect with? Does it have illustrations where they're appropriate? And thinking about, is it a text that's going to elicit a response? So that could be that it makes them curious, it could be that it makes them angry, excited, they enjoy it, they find it amusing. As long as it's going to evoke something in them, it's a good book. And big don'ts. I know we've put those kind of preparation post-it notes in of those little asides and the odd thing to do, but don't break the story up by analysing it. Let the story do the work. So especially on that day one, just read it to them. Don't overstimulate the area in your environment as well. I call it beanbags. Well, we all do beanbags and broomsticks. What I mean by that is, yes, it's lovely if you've got a beanbag in your reading corner, but if you've got 30 to 40 children in your space, which a lot of classes do have, and you've got 2 beanbags, only 2 children get the comfort of those beanbags. So just strip it back and keep it simple. We don't want to spend hours creating an environment with hanging leaves or whatever it is we've got in that reading corner or that reading space, because actually that's not what makes a reader. What makes a reader is having access to amazing literature and being read to. And the other one I always put is don't substitute it with something else. I appreciate we all have big demands, timetables, all sorts of things going on. Doesn't matter where you're working, but that story time is almost sacred. So what I'd like to do, and then I'm going to leave it there for you today, is just think about the provisions that you currently have in place in your setting. It could be that children are working on different shifts, morning or afternoon, that they're only doing a couple of hours a week. But thinking about the resources that you've got as well. What would you like to have in the ideal? Can you map out how you might achieve it? What can you take from the session that I've shared with you today? Are there any potential barriers that you might need to consider? That could even be down to things like budget and funding, all of that kind of thing. And then after today, what are you going to try? What are you going to have a go at? And then think about the learners in your provision that you work within at the moment. How could any of the strategies that I've shared with you today help those learners? So just maybe make a few jottings on that, and then I'm going to share a little quote with you. So Ruth Miskin in the UK said the following, and I really love this. There are better ways to foster a love of reading. Start by making sure that they can read, and by reading to them every single day. Reading is its own reward. There are worlds to discover inside a book, and children can find people just like them and those that are different. A book can make them feel happy, them sad, excited, touched, or even angry at times. But that book is definitely a powerful tool. So thank you very much, everybody. I'll leave that reflection up for you. I hope that you found today helpful. I'll stay around now on the chat. So if you do want to ask any questions, I'll be here for about another 15 minutes or so. If I don't know the answer, I can probably point you in the right direction. And thank you very much for listening. Take care. Stop that spreadsheet. So if I've just put on there about Twitter, Emotional Literacy Lab UK. This is something a friend of mine was actually working on. And they're a supplier, but they supply ranges from hundreds of publishers. The emotional, I've got a huge box, apologies. The Emotional Literacy Lab stuff really hones in on that emotional need, particularly if they've had turbulent times as well. So some of these are a bit younger, but actually, Tom Percival, he's amazing because although it's a younger book, you can delve deeper into feelings as well, even up to the age if their language was first language was English, for example. Even up to about the age of 11 or 12, these are great. Tom Percival did one as well called Perfectly Norman, and it's about a boy that grows his wings and he keeps on trying to hide his identity. Absolutely fabulous. I've got these fiction ones as well by Lisa Thompson, Owen and the Soldier. And just find the others. Some of these are a bit longer. There are authors in there as well. They're really good. They would take obviously a lot longer than a week, but the picture books. Morag Hood, anything by Morag Hood is fabulous. Let me just find. Oh yeah, I love that one. Julian is a mermaid. All of these are just amazing. If you take a little note. This one is absolutely brilliant as well. The Truth About Old People. I've got 100 to be honest. Let me just see which ones are a little bit older. Mind you, for picture books, I don't think you can really cap it. They go up to any age range. That's generally my motto. I've used them with much older children as well, and they just get really into the zone with them, especially if it's just that week cycle and we're still working on that language. Let me see what else I've got in here. No, it's not as good. I also think as well, so we've got Jessica Love, she's amazing. Lugna and the Pebble by Wendy Medor, she's a beautiful writer. Alina Ellis, another amazing one. I think often as well we can get into the rut where we're using the same author over and over again, and actually that narrows it. So although I love some of the Julia Donaldson stuff, that's good for that rhyme and that repetition, but actually there's some amazing modern authors out there that are just phenomenal and we just don't know about them. Morag Hood would definitely be one of those. She's done loads on identity, so although at first instance they just look really simple, it blows your mind by the end. Marsha Williams, The Cloud Boy, that's a fairly new title as well, if you can get your hands on that. This is all from the Emotional Literacy Lab stuff. No Ballet Shoes in Syria. Especially with the themes as well, but that would be, yeah. This one is about Aya, who's 11 years old and has just arrived in Britain with her mum and baby brother seeking asylum. She stumbles across a local ballet class, but they must fight to be allowed to remain in the country. That's quite harsh. It's amazing, and the message is there. Yeah, they're just brilliant. But it might be that you need longer depending on how long your session runs as well. Jason Reynolds. These are pretty much this year actually, all of these. This one's good. It could go on for a little bit longer, but it's about relationships and friendships. So all of that Emotional Literacy Lab UK, that's all of these. So they use a range of authors and publishers. I've got more. Sean Tan as well. Sean Tan does picture books for older children. Really good. That's a good one. But each of these have different themes, and although these are for older children and some of the interest levels are higher, they've got those illustrations to dig into as well, just a little bit quirkier. And this poetry one, but these are poetry. This is poetry for some of the bigger children as well. Hopscotch in the Sky, it's called. I definitely get on Twitter if you can. Some of the Kate Greenaway, I think it's Kate Greenaway prize recommendations. They didn't end up running it this year because we went into lockdown, but they have some good recommendations. Does that help? Kate Milner as well. It's called I Am Refugee. And I'm doing a webinar in that in a couple of weeks' time, I think it is, on here. And she does some amazing texts as well, but they could be used with those older children, definitely.